So I was debating with some self-identified members of the alt-right, who obviously didn't like me very much, but the discussion made me ask myself, as someone who is a very strong believer in the theory of evolution and the idea of fit and unfit traits, how do I reconcile this with, for example, social Darwinism? It is never enough to say that something is wrong because it's simply obviously wrong. When things are obvious, there is even more of a necessity to question them. So I eventually came to two basic reasons. Firstly, social Darwinism didn't really recognize its own subjectivity. In other words, just because I believe a trait is ideal does not mean I am right. There is no objective determinant. You could say, well, evolution is the objective judge, but evolution probably wouldn't have selected for intelligence if the majority of dinosaurs weren't wiped out by chance. So if you go down that road, prepare for you and evolution to disagree a lot. Now, evolution really just simply determines the winner, but there is no objective stance on who should have won. Therefore, I might value emotional intelligence, but that road may ultimately lead to self-destruction. There's no way to say that the trait I want objectively should be selected for. But okay, let's say that I have found a trait that I believe is the opposite of ideal and evolution agrees. Up until now, it has gradually wiped this toxic trait out of existence wherever it's come to exist. So now, is it okay to let social Darwinism do its thing? Well, at this point, we're tempted to say, okay, it's natural. Let evolution run its course. But what we don't really think about is that, by definition, even though it's natural, evolution itself is unfair. It's the unfair suffering of those that were born with or developed unfit traits. This can mean either living a satisfying life but not reproducing, or, much more often, dying miserably before even getting a chance to reproduce. Now, if you believe in scientific determinism, you have to recognize that nobody chooses anything they are or they become. We are simply experiencing machines placed into these genes and our environments, and the rest is simply cause and effect. So why do I deserve a happy life just because I got the right genes and environment, and you deserve to suffer just because you got the wrong ones? Well, when you really think about it from the perspective of scientific determinism, nobody deserves anything. But we can all agree that, masochistic pleasure aside, nobody wants to suffer. Again, if you're a person of science, scientific determinism dictates that nobody inherently deserves anything different. Thus, if we subjectively deem that it is not okay if an organism with the fit genes suffers, then it is also not okay that an organism with the unfit genes suffers. Just because someone is flawed doesn't mean that they deserve to suffer the ramifications of those flaws. For a minute, imagine if you were born with Huntington's disease. You didn't choose the genes that now cause you to suffer, and evolutionary selection now demands that you die, perhaps before you even reproduce, such that these genes will die with you, because you were unfit. But all you did was be born, and you didn't even choose that. When we think about this situation, it helps us empathize with the unfit, and recognize the tragedy that is all evolution. The only tool of evolutionary selection is, and always has been, by definition, suffering. Now, obviously, we can't stop evolution just because it's based around suffering. It's a necessary suffering. Without it, there would be even more suffering. But just because it's necessary doesn't mean we shouldn't acknowledge the suffering. And just because it's natural doesn't mean that the suffering is okay when it happens to someone else if we consider it not acceptable to happen to us. But I want you to think about something. In the history of life, since the very first cell, there has been an overwhelming quantity of suffering. Think about how much suffering had to occur for you to have limbs. Every generation, some organisms passed the test of natural selection with above-average proto-limbs, and some organisms failed. When we talk about natural selection, we're talking about birds being born without wings, slow deers getting eaten alive. There is always a victim. Evolution is a necessary tragedy. And in an ideal world, we would be able to prevent it, or at least the suffering aspect. But we can't. That's not practical. and any attempts at this would likely just create more suffering. If we try to fix this enormous problem, we wouldn't have the resources left to allow ourselves to grow. What we do right now, functioning as a free marketplace of genes, is a very productive system, where good fortune is reinvested into the next generation, resulting in better and better genes. At best, in my opinion, society could attempt to give everyone ideal genes such that no one must suffer the selection process, and simply instead regulate population size while developing and testing novel genes on a group genetically designed to not have the capacity to suffer. But even that could unintentionally just create a new kind of suffering that we can't comprehend yet, so there is no simple answer. But just keep in mind that every time you kill a mosquito, even though that mosquito had to die because it was a direct threat to you, even though this was simply the process of evolution selecting against mosquitoes, that mosquito still suffered. Just because the suffering was necessary doesn't mean it was any less genuine. There was still some degree of consciousness experiencing pain. And if that's not okay when it happens to you, it's not okay when it must happen to someone else. So at this point, it becomes apparent that just because I personally value a specific kind of intelligence, I can't kill off those who lack this intelligence. Firstly, because I could be wrong about this trait being ideal, and secondly, because evolutionary selection does not justify the suffering. If we have any hand in evolutionary selection, it must be to reduce suffering, because there is already an unacceptable amount. So thus, back to the original issue of reconciling my interest with natural selection with the horrors of the past manifestations of social Darwinism, based on my personal philosophy, the only ethical way to work towards creating a subjectively determined ideal genetic climate is through offering gene therapy. If the genes you determine to be ideal are truly ideal, well then eventually they will result in a subpopulation that more people want to become a part of, which they will have the opportunity to by opting into the gene therapy. This all can be applied to culture as well, since it too goes through a social evolutionary selection process, which people can also opt into, with reculturalization. I'd personally suggest that we each work towards creating a culture that values the traits that we each value. This can ultimately trickle down into mating selection and make the traits that we desire more prominent in future generations. In all cases, what's most important to recognize is that if you consider yourself fit evolutionarily, you are fortunate, and you shouldn't allow anybody to shame you for being fortunate. But it also doesn't make you better than anybody else. And even though it's absolutely not your responsibility, in my opinion, you should still aspire to help the unfit become fit, because nobody deserved to be unfit. Anyways, tell me why I'm a parasite in the comments, and to make things easier, just type 1 for you're a racist, bigot, xenophobe, and type 2 for you're a dirty Jew trying to tear down society.